Well, the 6 jurors deciding the fate of George Zimmerman will get back to work in about an hour and a half's time at the courthouse in Sanford, Florida. The women deliberated for just over 3.5 hours on Friday. They did not return a verdict when they adjourned at 6 p.m. The jury could send Zimmerman to prison for killing Trayvon Martin or let him walk free if they believe his claim of self-defense. So I want to bring in Pate. He's been following this very closely. He's a criminal defense attorney. Thank you for being with us. I appreciate it.
Good morning.
I want to talk first about the closing arguments and what kind of impact you think those have on juries, because there are those that say the decision is made before the closing argument, and others look at how different they were, sort of professorial coming from the defense and impassioned coming from the prosecution.
Well, they certainly had different styles, and I think there's a reason for that. You know, in this case, the state really needs to use emotion, and they did, both in their first closing argument and in their last closing argument. They're trying to get the jury to remember that this case is about a dead teenager. The defense needs to do the opposite thing, and that's what they did. They said, look, there's a lot of emotion here, but let's focus on the law. The judge is going to tell you what the law is, what the state needs to prove, and in this case, the state has not done that. And if you have more questions now than you had at the beginning of the trial, you can't convict him. So I think both sides did a good job. But as far as the purpose of closing arguments, I think you're right. I think most jurors are not going to make up their mind in closing arguments. They're not going to be persuaded to, change the way they're seeing the evidence at that point in the trial. The good purpose of closing arguments is for the lawyer to give those jurors that he thinks is supporting his side good arguments for them to take back with them in the jury room so that they can convince the others.
I want to ask you specifically about one element of Marco Mauer's closing, that 4 minutes that he asked the jury to sit in silence. Do you think that resonated, or did it come off as a stunt?
I think it resonated. You know, he's not a very dramatic personality. Most of the closing argument, as you said, was very professorial. Let me walk you through the evidence. Let's talk about the law. But silence can be very effective, especially when you're talking about timing and trying to put them in George Zimmerman's shoes and trying to see if the state's case makes sense. Trayvon Martin had all this time. Let me let you see what it feels like to actually sit for 4 minutes and realize what he could have done during that time.
And the burden of proof here lies on the prosecution. So I want to play our viewers some sound from the defense attorney, Marco Mauer, talking about the burden of proof.
How many could-have-beens have you heard from the state in this case? How many what-ifs have you heard from the state in this case? Well, I don't think, anyway, they don't get to ask you that. I don't think they get to say to you, what do you think? No. What have I proven to you? What have I convinced you beyond a reasonable doubt occurred in this case, so much so that you don't have any reasonable doubt as to those issues that I presented to you?
Beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
Did the prosecution meet that burden beyond a reasonable doubt?
I don't think so. And that's what's unusual about a self-defense case. Once the defense raises the idea of self-defense, then the prosecution has to disprove it beyond a reasonable doubt, in addition to proving all the elements of their case. So it's a very high burden, and I just don't think they met it in this case.
Prosecutor John Guy, he mentioned specifically and did not want the jury to forget that this case, at the center of it, there is a dead teenager. Let's listen to that.
Was that child not in fear when he was running from that defendant? Isn't that every child's worst nightmare? To be followed on the way home in the dark by a stranger? Isn't that every child's worst fear? That was Trayvon Martin's last emotion.
Our Sonny Hostin, who was in the courtroom, says that this certainly resonated with the jury. There's been a lot of talk about there being an all-female jury, 5 of them mothers, and that hit home.
I think so. And most of the trial has all been about what was George Zimmerman thinking, what was George Zimmerman doing. And I think very effectively, Mr. Guy said, wait a minute, put yourself in Trayvon Martin's shoes. What was he doing? What was he thinking? Did he deserve to die? Very effective. But you'll remember the judge charged the jury at the end of the trial and said, look, you're not supposed to use emotion. You're not supposed to use sympathy or prejudice. Are they going to listen? That's always the question.
All right, criminal defense attorney Pate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up on New Day, his biggest hit was